It was a warm summer evening when everything started to shift between Emily and me. I stood on the porch of my father's house, watching the sun sink low in the sky, casting long shadows over the yard. Emily had been my stepmother for nearly 10 years, and while things had always been complicated between us, they were about to get a whole lot more complicated. My dad had met Emily not long after my mom passed away. I was 15 then, old enough to understand how much he needed someone, but still young enough to be bitter about it. Emily was only 10 years older than me, and while she had always been kind, there was something about her presence in our house that made everything feel off balance. She was never just a mother figure to me. Years passed, and we settled into a routine. My dad worked long hours, and Emily became the one who was always around, always there for me in ways my dad could not be. She helped me with homework, showed up at my games, and we grew closer. But as I got older, that closeness started to feel different. I began to notice things about her. The way her smile lingered a little too long when we talked. The way her eyes flicked over me when she thought I was not paying attention. When I went off to college, I thought the distance would help. I figured that whatever strange tension I had been feeling would fade, that it was just something I would grow out of. But every time I came home to visit, it was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. And now, standing here on the porch, waiting for Emily to come outside, I knew things had reached a tipping point. She stepped outside, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. "Nate," she said with that familiar smile, the one that had always made me feel both comfortable and uneasy. "It's good to have you home." "Yeah, it's good to be back," I replied, shoving my hands in my pockets to steady myself. I tried to ignore the way my heart skipped a beat at the sight of her, the way my chest tightened when she stood too close. She walked over, leaning against the railing beside me. "You've grown up so much," she said, her voice soft. "Every time I see you, it's like you're a completely different person." I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "You see me more than Dad does these days." She sighed, her smile fading slightly. "He's been working late a lot." There was a pause, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we were not saying. I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine, the way the space between us seemed to shrink with every passing second. "Nate," she said quietly, turning to face me. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" I nodded, feeling my stomach knot. "Yeah, sure." We moved inside, sitting down in the living room. She poured us each a glass of wine, something that had become a habit during my visits home. We sat there for a moment, the wine untouched on the table between us, as she fidgeted with her hands in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began, her eyes downcast. "About you. About us." My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the air in the room shift. I knew what she was going to say before she said it. We had both been dancing around this for years, avoiding the truth because we knew how wrong it was. But now, sitting here with her, I realized there was no turning back. "Emily," I started, but she cut me off. "Nate, I can't keep pretending that everything is normal between us," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it's wrong. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I do. And I think you feel it too." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. She was right. I had felt it for years, the way my heart would race when she was near, the way my eyes lingered on her when I knew they shouldn't. But hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Emily," I said, my voice thick, "we can't." "I know," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "But I don't know what to do anymore. I can't keep pretending like this doesn't exist. It's killing me." I looked at her, my mind racing. This was my father's wife, the woman who had practically raised me since I was a teenager. But the feelings I had for her were real, undeniable, and they had been there for so long that I didn't know how to stop them. "I don't know what to do either," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "But we can't let this happen. It's too risky. It'll ruin everything." She nodded, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "I know, but I don't want to lose you, Nate. I don't want to lose what we have." "You're not going to lose me," I said, reaching out to take her hand. The moment our fingers touched, A jolt of electricity shot through me, and I knew there was no going back. But we have to be careful. She nodded again, but her hand stayed in mine, her fingers tightening around mine as if she was afraid to let go. We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of what we had just admitted hanging heavy in the air. The line between us had blurred, and no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, things were never going to be the same. The next few weeks were a blur. Emily and I tried to keep our distance, to pretend like nothing had changed between us, but it was impossible. Every time I came home, the tension between us grew stronger, the pull of something forbidden and dangerous too hard to resist. One night, after my father had gone to bed, Emily and I found ourselves alone in the living room, the air between us thick with unspoken feelings. She was sitting next to me on the couch, her hand resting on mine, and I could feel my resolve slipping away with every passing second. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending like everything is fine." Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was hesitant at first but quickly grew desperate. The feel of her lips against mine, the way her body pressed into me, sent a surge of emotion through me that I couldn't control. I knew it was wrong, but in that moment, I didn't care. We pulled apart, both of us breathless, the reality of what we had just done sinking in. "Emily, we have to stop," I said, my voice rough. We can't." "I know," she whispered, her forehead resting against mine, "but I don't want to." Neither did I, but I knew we had to. In the months that followed, Emily and I struggled to navigate the mess we had created. We tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy around my father, but every time we were alone, the tension between us threatened to boil over. It was a dangerous game, one that we both knew could end in disaster, but we couldn't seem to stop. I started staying away more, spending time at friends' places, avoiding home as much as I could. But no matter how far I ran, the pull toward Emily was always there, waiting for me when I returned. One night, I came home late, the house quiet. I walked inside, expecting everyone to be asleep, but Emily was still up, sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red from crying. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what was coming. We had been teetering on the edge of something dangerous for too long, and it was time to face the consequences. "This can't go on," she said, her eyes pleading with me. "We're going to destroy everything if we keep doing this." "I know," I said, my voice hollow, "but I don't know how to stop." She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she wiped away another tear. "We have to. For your father's sake. For both of us." I nodded, but the ache in my chest told me that this wasn't going to be easy. I loved her, as wrong as it was, but I knew she was right. We couldn't keep going like this. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We'll stop." We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of our decision hanging heavy in the air. I knew this was the end of whatever had been building between us, but it didn't make it any less painful. Over the next few months, things slowly returned to normal. Emily and I kept our distance, focusing on rebuilding the boundaries we had crossed. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I caught her looking at me with the same longing I felt, but we both knew what was at stake. We had to stop before we ruined everything. It wasn't the ending I had wanted, but it was the one we needed. And even though I told myself it was for the best, the ache inside me never fully went away. I thought I would be able to push the feelings down, to bury them somewhere deep enough that they could never surface again. But every time I was in the same room as Emily, it all came rushing back. We were careful, though. We both knew that we had to be. My dad had no idea about what had almost happened, and I wasn't sure if he would ever forgive either of us if he found out. So, we danced around each other, trying to act like things were normal, like we hadn't crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But the tension between us was always there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would boil over again. One evening, a few months after our agreement to stop, my father announced he had to leave for a business trip. It was just a weekend trip, but as soon as he said it, I felt my stomach tighten. I knew what it meant. Emily and I would be alone in the house. No buffers, no distractions, just the two of us, with nothing but our unresolved feelings to keep us company. "Can you make sure everything's all right while I'm gone?" my dad asked, looking between the two of us. He had no idea how loaded that request was, how the weight of it settled between us like a ticking time bomb. "Of course," Emily said, her smile tight. "We'll manage." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, but inside, I was anything but calm. I knew what was coming. I had been fighting it for months, but with my dad gone, there would be no more excuses to hide behind. No more distractions to keep us apart. The first evening without him passed quietly enough. Emily made dinner, and we sat at the table in awkward silence, both of us trying too hard to act normal. But the longer we sat there, the more I could feel the tension building. It was like the air in the room was charged with something electric, and I knew that sooner or later, it would snap. After dinner, we retreated to separate corners of the house, both of us avoiding the inevitable. I sat in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV without really watching anything. I could hear Emily in the kitchen, cleaning up, but I could tell from the way the dishes clinked and clattered that she was just as on edge as I was. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked into the kitchen. Emily was standing at the sink, her back to me, but I could tell from the way her shoulders were tense that she knew I was there. "Emily," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. She froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, but she didn't turn around. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling, but I couldn't stop. I had been holding back for so long, and now, with no one around to stop us, everything I had been trying to suppress came flooding to the surface. "I can't do this anymore," I said, stepping closer. My heart was racing, and every fiber of my being was screaming at me to turn around, to walk away before we crossed the line again. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. She turned around slowly, her eyes locking onto mine, and I could see the conflict written all over her face. "Nate, we promised," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We can't do this." "I know," I said, my voice rough, "but I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep acting like I don't feel this way." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head, biting her lip. "This is wrong," she whispered. "We can't." I took another step closer, closing the distance between us. "I know it's wrong, but that doesn't change how I feel." She looked up at me, her breath hitching, and I could see the same struggle I had been feeling reflected in her eyes. We both knew this was a line we shouldn't cross again, but the pull between us was too strong. Before I could think about what I was doing, I reached out and gently cupped her face in my hands. She closed her eyes, leaning into my touch for just a moment, and I could feel the tension in her body begin to melt away. "We can stop," I whispered, my thumb brushing lightly over her cheek. "Just say the word, and I'll stop." But she didn't say anything. She just stood there, her eyes closed, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and I knew that she didn't want to stop any more than I did. I leaned in, my forehead resting against hers, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. "Emily," I whispered, my voice filled with the same desperation that had been gnawing at me for months. "Tell me to stop." But she didn't. Instead, she reached up, her fingers curling into the fabric of my shirt, pulling me closer. The moment our lips met, everything else fell away. The guilt, the fear, the voices in the back of our minds telling us that this was wrong. They all disappeared, leaving only the two of us and the overwhelming need we had tried so hard to deny. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant, like we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, and all the pent-up tension, all the forbidden feelings we had been fighting, came rushing to the surface. Her hands slid up around my neck, pulling me closer, and I could feel the way her body pressed into mine, warm and soft. For a moment, it was perfect. For a moment, I let myself believe that we could have this, that we could keep it a secret, keep it safe, and that everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that what we were doing was dangerous, that we were playing with fire, and sooner or later, we were going to get burned. We broke apart, both of us breathless, our foreheads still resting together. Her eyes were wide, filled with the same mixture of desire and fear that had been swirling inside me for months. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," I said, my voice barely audible, "but I don't know how to stop." She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching mine. "Your dad." "I know," I said, cutting her off. "I know what's at stake, but I—" Before I could finish, she pressed her fingers to my lips, silencing me. "Nate, we have to stop this. If your dad ever finds out—" I swallowed hard, the weight of her words hitting me like a ton of bricks. I knew she was right. We couldn't keep doing this. It would destroy everything. My relationship with my dad, her marriage, everything we had built over the years. But as much as I wanted to promise her that I would stop, that we could go back to the way things were, I knew it wasn't that simple. "I'll stop," I said, my voice thick. "I'll stop if that's what you want." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with tears. "It's not about what I want," she whispered. "It's about what's right." I nodded, stepping back and running a hand through my hair. "Yeah," I muttered. "You're right." We stood there in silence for a long time, the tension between us still palpable, but now it was laced with guilt and regret. I could feel the weight of our choices pressing down on me, and I knew that this was the last time. We couldn't keep doing this. We couldn't keep risking everything. "I'll go," I said finally, turning toward the door. "I'll stay at a friend's place until Dad gets back." "Nate," she called softly, and I stopped in my tracks, turning back to look at her. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and I could see the regret etched into every line of her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Me too," I said quietly before walking out the door. I spent the rest of the weekend at a friend's place, trying to clear my head, trying to figure out how to move forward from the mess we had created. When my dad got back, I avoided Emily as much as I could, keeping my distance and doing my best to pretend like nothing had changed. But the truth was, everything had changed. There was no going back from what we had done, no undoing the damage we had caused. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and even though we both knew it was over, the weight of our choices would stay with us forever.